Hey gang, this week's episode is brought to you by oldschoolshirts.com. Hey, check them out. You like defunct teams and leagues and t-shirt form? Well, you'll find them there, but a whole bunch of other stuff too. Do you remember a radio station of the past or perhaps a mall that you used to go to? All kinds of great cultural and sports memories can be found at the great folks at oldschoolshirts.com. Promo code GOODSEATS for 10% off all of your purchases. And now, here's our show.
The biggest soccer games in the world are coming to your hometown, and you can't watch, that is, unless you can shell out some serious cash. Official World Cup match tickets are going for upwards of $11,000, with resale reaching as high as $2 million. These outrageous prices led New York and New Jersey to launch investigations into FIFA just weeks before the games are set to begin. Attorneys General Letitia James of New York and Jennifer Davenport of New Jersey released a statement today announcing they have subpoenaed FIFA, seeking information about its ticketing practices for the 8 World Cup matches set to take place in New Jersey. CNN's Bryn Gingras joins me now. Bryn, what do they expect to find?
Yeah, look, they're looking at how many tickets were allocated for these different games. Not only, Jake, in New York, New Jersey Stadium, MetLife as we know it here, of course, but also if a New York, New Jersey consumer bought tickets at a different stadium for the World Cup, they want to know more about that as well. So they have a very wide scope of this investigation that they're looking into. And look, Jake, I talked to a fan who's based in Washington State and actually said he hopes his attorney general takes some similar action. But he basically told me this story about how he went online, waited in a queue for 12 hours to get World Cup tickets in Seattle, finally got to a point where he could pick his 2 seats. He said they were pretty good seats on the side of the pitch, not behind a goalpost, waited another 5 minutes to check out, finally paid $515 each for those tickets. And then when he got the confirmation, his seats were in a completely different area of the stadium. These are the kinds of stories that were put out in the press. And what the New York Attorney General's office said to me basically was they heard about these stories and now they want to know more. Why did this happen? How did this happen? Did they break any laws? And they actually aren't the first attorneys general to take action. California also has put into an inquiry with FIFA for similar questions, wondering what sort of disclosures are given to these buyers before they purchase tickets. So there's a lot of questions that are outstanding here. And the big question for fans, as I talked to one, is will there be any recourse? Will there be any restitution? Of course, the games start in just a couple of weeks. FIFA at the moment is saying that they have no comment on these investigations that are now opened, but the fans are telling me that they're just happy someone is at least on their side because what they're dealing with is really just taking away from the whole entire experience.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
All right, it's finally here. How are you, everybody? My name is Tim Hanlon, and this, of course, is Good Seats Still Available, the curious little podcast that is devoted to what used to be in professional sports. I appreciate you finding us, and this is it's make or break time, friends. The World Cup is finally here. This will be our last of a number of conversations that we've had leading up to this more than controversial version of the world's biggest sporting event. And I don't know, as we record this a couple of days before the opening 2 games in Mexico and all the ones to follow afterwards, I think it is a huge uncertainty as to what's going to transpire in this tournament that will now feature 48 teams, more than 100 games, unprecedented amount of scale. Ticket sales, as you heard there from Jake Tapper and his colleague there on CNN a few days ago. But that's just the start. I mean, the outrageous pricing, the duplicitous manner by which FIFA has sold these tickets or held back, artificially created scarcity, etc., is but just a small part of the overall story. There's the U.S. government approach to visas and potential ICE raids and all of that kind of stuff that continues as part of it. You've got just an enormous amount of logistical uncertainties when it comes to getting to games. The cities that signed up for this thing kind of realizing perhaps after the fact that they are going to have to shoulder the burden of getting people to and from these games and covering the costs and the security, the perimeters around these stadia and the inability to drive to games and get out and park and all that kind of stuff. Just all kinds of uncertainties let alone just the normal logistics of a tournament like this with literally thousands of miles of travel and the heat. It's going to be hot. It's going to be Africa hot in many respects. A lot of uncertainty around that. But as we will talk this week with our conversation with Simon Kuper, the author of perhaps the best, if there's one book to get to accompany your journey into this year's World Cup festivities, it is his book, World Cup Fever, A Soccer Journey in 9 Tournaments. It is by far one of the most heavily reviewed and positively reviewed books out there in the New York Times land, in Amazon. It's an editor's pick for best nonfiction. The New Yorker has called it a best book of 2026, and you will hear why in our conversation forthcoming. This is a gentleman who has been attending and covering World Cup since all the way back in 1990, which, of course, is the United States' breakthrough tournament, obviously leading up to the 1994 World Cup, with the United States hosting the last time this World Cup was here on these shores. And I think a good longitudinal understanding of what this tournament is all about, and the past number of, let's call them modern day tournaments, is certainly the focus of our conversation, and will be certainly additive to what will occur. What do we think will occur in this upcoming World Cup? And as Simon will tell us in a couple of seconds, there is a huge history of negative coverage and predictions for a tournament such as this. In tournaments past, Qatar last time around, with all kinds of different negative and frankly just frightful things about people dying in the rapid construction of these of the stadiums that were necessary for the tournament. Russia before them, not necessarily the most likable of host countries, and that kind of stuff, and all kinds of political and economic and fan issues bedeviling all kinds of World Cups going back decades and even a century or two. So which is it? Is it going to be a qualified success, as it often has wound up becoming in the face of all kinds of negativity and dour and dire predictions? Or will it be different this time? Will the cost of attending these games, will the heat, will all of the issues around government and the visas and in Iran and the war and all that kind of stuff and ICE raids, will all that kind of stuff just be unavoidable and just literally make this a challenging, if worse, tournament? We shall see. We don't know the answers to that, but we do have history on our side, and that is where our pal Simon Kuper comes into play as we talk about the world's game and his book, World Cup Fever. That book, of course, is available wherever you get good books. We've got a couple of convenient links for you in the show description or on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. And if you click and purchase in that general dynamic, you will give us a couple of shekels of referral love from our friends at Amazon when you do so. We appreciate your considering doing such. And let's get right to the conversation, shall we? It's something we had back in late January, if you can believe it. But this is finally the time, we think, to bring this conversation to you. Here's my chat with Simon. Please, as always, enjoy. Obviously, with the World Cup coming up this year in this continent, a lot of books coming out on the topic. But I was really intrigued by yours because you specifically pick a period of time in the sand and kind of push it forward to where we are today. Maybe I can start with this question. How about some background for our audience who don't know who you are and what you do for a living? And then more interestingly, I think, is give us some insight as to why the demarcation line that you chose to kind of frame the book and the history of the conversation.
Well, I'm a journalist writer who's been between soccer and non-sports topics my whole career. So I have a column in the Financial Times, which is often politics, society, culture, the world going to hell. And then I write
Oh,
books
just
on
that.
top of
Okay,
it.
sure. Good enough.
Anything. Yeah. So I spend a lot of time looking towards the US, obviously, at the moment. And then I've been writing sports books for over 30 years. And my latest one, which kind of prompts this podcast interview, I guess, is World Cup fever, which is my account of having been at the last 9 World Cups. So when you ask about the demarcation in that book, it's I start going to World Cups in 1990. I've been to every one since. I've been to 9. And although I do look at the origins of the World Cup, especially the guy who creates the World Cup, Jules Rimet, really, I then take the focus to modernity. And Jules Rimet brings me to another point that might be relevant. I'm a very international person. So I grew up in the Netherlands. I'm a fan of Holland, but I'm sort of of British and South African origin. And I now live in Paris, in France, with an American wife. So I straddle various countries in my approach.
So tell us how 1990 comes about, why that was your first one. Were you, quote unquote, on assignment? Did you kind of raise your hand for that gig? Where were you career-wise that brought you to Italy in 1990 for your first World Cup?
Well, I was a college student. I was at university in the UK. I mean, I was already writing soccer journalism. So I was writing a kind of monthly article about Dutch soccer for a magazine called World Soccer. So, from the age of 16, I was earning money as a journalist, which was nice. But really, I was just studying, and I'm in the college bar. Students will recognize this kind of scene. And a friend of mine says to me, if you had tickets for the World Cup in Italy, this is about a week before, would you go? And I didn't really understand the question because, if I had tickets to the World Cup, of course I would go, but there was no way I would have tickets to the World Cup. I was a poor student. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, I can get as many tickets for the World Cup free as we want. And he explained that he knew a guy whose dad worked for Mars. Mars was a World Cup sponsor. And the sponsors couldn't get rid of their tickets in 1990 because, American clients of Mars were not really interested in soccer. Asians didn't know about soccer. And the Europeans were terrified of going to the World Cup because, all the stories then were about English football hooligans. So Mars had been left with this whole stack of unused VIP tickets. And my friend said, let's take them. So a week later, 3 of us are driving in his car to Dover on the English coast. We take the ferry to France, the train to Italy, and we show up in Milan on the first night of the World Cup 1990. I'm a 20-year-old student.
And what was your expectation, and what did you sort of, and what was the reality that you saw in that tournament? Because it's interesting you mentioned the United States, right? Because that was, for those handful that were around at the time, and I count myself as one, of people still interested in professional versions of soccer in this country, right? Because we've talked about this many, many times on our show. There was I wouldn't call it a lull. That's probably being generous, right? But it was an abandonment, right? Having lost the top tier professional league, which for a hot moment with the New York Cosmos and all that kind of stuff was basically gone. There was no true professional top tier soccer in this country yet, despite all those that dark time. We actually qualified legitimately for 1990. So there was a small but hearty band of folks in the U.S. that was extremely interested in this. But you're mentioning it was not it wasn't an American cascade of interest. Describe to me, though, what you thought you were getting into with this World Cup. What were you prepared for? And maybe what did you what came out of it based on your experiences there?
Well, I mean, I was a starry-eyed kid who'd grown up watching World Cups on TV since 1978. And for me, like for many people, this was the biggest thing in the world, being at a World Cup. And then you get there, and it was a bit like being at a kind of village, July 4th celebration. It's all pretty small. And the stadiums are half empty. That was, very striking to me. You feel I'm at the center of the world. Where is everyone? And I remember going to see the US because we had tickets for bad games because those were the ones that Mars really wanted to get rid of. So one game was the US against Czechoslovakia. And I
remember it well for various reasons. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, as you might. And it was a bit like showing up at an indie music concert. The US fans were sort of college students like me. It was a very kind of minor gig, alternative music energy. And for the US, obviously, this is probably barely being covered in the newspapers at home. US team are college students. The stadium is half empty. It's all very amicable, and the US lose 5-0. And it's sort of funny. You're seeing people play in a World Cup who are not much better at soccer than me. I was the same sort of age. And so, yeah, fast forward 36 years, the US has never become the soccer country that it dreamed of coming on the men's side. But that 1990 just seems like it happened in another world for the US and for everyone, really.
Well, you also preface that with your, and maybe I should have asked this question first, is your original experience as the World Cup, which is very probably similar to mine, obviously, but different viewing experiences, right? With television, right? I mean, from the late 70s until, through the bulk of the 1980s, right? This was really a tournament that it had been televised for decades, or at least a couple of decades prior, but really from a global perspective was much more during that period of time, your youth, my youth, more accessible via television versus, this sort of arcane and historical, at least in the United States, closed circuit. You had to go to an arena and you had to pay money to go see it in a theater somewhere, or if that, right? I'm sure it was obviously different in Europe and other places in the world, but the reality is that television really started to enmesh itself into this tournament as we were growing up, right? So there had to be some kind of, I don't know, expectation of spectacle too, no, going into the tournament?
Yeah, I mean, what I describe in the book is one of the weird things about being at a World Cup is that you walk into a television set. Because starting with 1970, when it's televised in color from Mexico, it is first and foremost a television spectacle. And as the whole world switches on, it's made for living room viewing. So when you're in the stadium, it can be underwhelming because the fans, there's very few partisan fans there. Typically, the majority of people are from the home country. They don't really care who wins. Since 2014, people are taking selfies. So it's more like being at a kind of music concert for a kind of Rolling Stones big name act sort of thing. And so the emotions are much stronger in living rooms. So, my children support France. Their raw emotion and their viewings with friends are much more emotional the last 8 years than me in the stadium in Moscow or Qatar or whatever. So yeah, you have to understand the World Cup as a TV set.
And that's even more so now. We'll get to sort of your current and future sort of prognostications about this tournament and where all of this is going. I can't wait to hear it from a pro like yourself because I have opinions. Let's put it that way. How do you how does your experience there eventually become a gig, so to speak, for you every 4 years, right? Because you came to the United States in '94 as well. You mentioned in the book in a couple of different settings like Foxborough, Massachusetts. How was that different than '90? And I'll ask, what were your expectations given it was the big old USA, which, as I mentioned earlier, did not have a pro league at the time. And as we, certainly knew in the years the coming, that part of the reason for getting it was to also launch a pro league after this tournament was done.
Well, I experienced it somewhat from the inside because in 1993, I went to the US as a student, year of graduate study, living in Boston. And during the year, I tried to get a gig at the World Cup, and eventually ABC TV offered me a kind of very lowly job where I had to spot players during matches so their names could be put up on screen when they scored a goal or got a red card or something. I was terrible at that because my facial recognition skills were very poor. So ABC quickly got rid of me. But I was living in Boston and I just joined my newspaper, the Financial Times. They'd hired me, but I hadn't started work yet. And they said, well, you can start covering, your first job can be covering the World Cup. You're in Boston anyway. And so I was covering that for the Financial Times and ABC. So I was really living the tournament. I was taking the media bus out to Foxborough every day. And it was weird because you felt almost nobody around me knows the World Cup is even happening. So there were little pockets in Boston. There was the North End where I'd got in the habit of going to watch Italian soccer on Sunday mornings. North End was very Italian, still then, a lot of immigrants, and they cared. And then there were bars around town where you watch with Nigerians and Bulgarians and Moroccans, the immigrants, all those people knew exactly everything that was going on. And that was the kind of community in which I experienced the World Cup when I was not in Foxborough Stadium being shouted at by ABC producers. And then, there's this big sea of America where nobody knew this was happening. I remember I went to Fenway Park with a friend once during the World Cup to watch the Red Sox. And, we're talking to people in the crowd and we were saying, oh, we're both covering the Soccer World Cup. And people literally said, what is that? So it was a totally different era in US soccer. But what you always had is, you had the media that were in English. And then in a city like Boston, you had a lot of life that happened in other languages. So I was in the city center when Brazil beat the US in the quarterfinal. You remember?
Absolutely.
Very emotional game. The US played really well. Brazil win 1-0. And on the final whistle, the city center fills with thousands of people in yellow Brazil shirts. So Boston, for a moment, looks like a Brazilian city. So all these immigrant groups, ethnic groups were living the World Cup, but it was very subterranean.
Yeah, and that has been the knock for the modern version of the pro game in the United States. The game existed in various pro fashions for hundreds of years actually, but the latest sort of burst of the pro game here, and certainly the national team thing is always been that dynamic of it's usually been these ethnic enclaves that wind up buying the tickets for these U.S. national games against whatever team they're playing. And that's the irony of it all, right? I mean, ostensibly, the U.S. has always historically been this, at least until recent times, this come one, come all melting pot, right? And soccer, the ultimate, I think, universal sport, right, is probably the prime example of that. And here we are in the United States in '94, where it is kind of subterranean, right? The traditional American sports fan, right, still has this askance, arched eyebrow thing about didn't soccer die, 15 years ago. And here it was basically living and breathing, but not quote unquote US per se.
Yeah, I wouldn't agree that that's still true. I mean, I saw a survey recently where more Americans cite soccer as their favorite sport than baseball. I would say soccer has become a significant minority sport, especially among younger people, especially among urban people. It's just totally different. And the ethnic side, I think, will be much less in evidence at this World Cup. I mean, if you think of Mexican immigrants, single largest immigrant group, in normal times, people would be gathering in bars, watching Mexico, in Mexico shirts, supporting Mexico. I mean, you can imagine they're not about to do that now, with ICE roaming the cities. People a lot of Hispanics, as you know, are very frightened. And so that kind of public display of your home ethnicity, I think, is going to be much more difficult, especially for Hispanic groups during this World Cup. By contrast, the kind of, how shall we put it, the native-born Americans, the people who've been Americans for generations, young people are much more soccer-oriented than was imaginable in 1994. And the MLS, Major League Soccer, is still quite a weak league, but it's a tiny part of the massive mosaic that is American soccer, where people are watching the Premier League, watching Mexican soccer, engaging with soccer from all around the world.
No, but no question. I'll get to your current comments in a bit, but I couldn't agree more. And it's an amazing dichotomy that we're entering this upcoming cup with, as you laid out. But again, as a long suffering American soccer fan back in that time, right? I went to 10 of those games during that tournament, which is just, it would cost me now $1.5 million, I think, to go to the games, right? But it was amazing if you were a soccer fan and frankly, somebody a long suffering one who had been through the boom and the bust. It was, in some respects, almost kind of a happy kind of revenge that, hey, we're coming back as a sport. But I don't think anybody would have seen it coming. I want to look at some of these other tournaments, though, because, you spent a lot of time in the 98 France World Cup, but it also it seems like it begins a journey of, of FIFA and the world stage and the tournament becoming this higher order kind of a spectacle. I would maybe argue perhaps that 98 was kind of sort of the beginnings of that, but But then this tour, shall we say, literally around the globe, to places that historically would not have been confused with a World Cup tournament, nor soccer, as FIFA, I suspect, really kind of figured out that they want to truly be a global sport and going and pioneering places. If we did it in the United States, we should be able to do it elsewhere too. But I'm putting my line of thinking against yours. But talk about '98, because that was really kind of that was a big deal for you and for the tournament.
Yeah, I mean, 98, I agree, is the kind of end of the European, Latin American hegemony over hosting the World Cups. And the US has been a brief departure. And then in the 21st century, it becomes the norm to just go to new territories. And of course, Europe is losing importance within the world, economically, politically, everything. 98 for me was really significant. I was working at the Financial Times. I had a very dull job covering the currency markets. So it was just an immense kind of release and liberation to be able to go around France and write about soccer all the time. And more importantly, I think, see these beautiful cities and eat incredible food every day and get used to French life, how the French do it at their best, in summer, three-course lunches outside on a terrace and that kind of thing. And after the World Cup, it was very hard for me to go back to my boring job in London wearing a suit, in an office where the windows didn't open. And about a month after the World Cup, I resigned and I became a freelance soccer writer. And then a couple of years later, I discovered you could buy property very cheaply in Paris. So I bought an apartment in Paris here, where I'm speaking to you from now, for about $100,000, ridiculous price. And then I thought, well, maybe I won't just use it as an investment. It was the only thing I owned. I'll go and live there. And so 25 plus years later, I'm still here. And so I say in the book, World Cup 98 changed my life. It put me on a course I'd never considered before of living in Paris. And I have children born in Paris who unfortunately support France at World Cups. And this wouldn't have happened if I hadn't covered World Cups. So be careful.
What was it about the game that was giving you confidence to make that jump? Because I would imagine you could look back at that period of time through an historical lens and say there was really a corporatization, if you will, of the sport. I mean, it really seems like that's where kind of the money and the bigness, if you will, of these tournaments was really starting to kind of inflate.
Well, it's true that soccer changes in the 90s, and it's driven by pay TV. So Rupert Murdoch and Silvio Berlusconi in Italy start paying soccer very large amounts of money to televise it and then sell it to subscribers. And so the game gets rich. If you look at the kind of graphs of income of soccer clubs, it just takes a straight line up from about 1992 and it continues going to about 2019. And so, the coverage becomes bigger. In Britain, it had always been seen before the 90s as a slightly dirty, slightly working class sport that posh people didn't bother with. That completely changes. And so, there's more jobs, more opportunities to cover soccer. And I rode that wave. I'd written a soccer book by then already. And, I thought I can either be a lowly paid person writing about the currency market every day in a suit, or I can be a higher paid writer, going to Milan and Madrid and covering soccer. And although I didn't only want to cover soccer, it was a better option for me at the time. So the World Cup grows and becomes more international, but I would say that the big change is in club soccer.
Did you enjoy the full-timeness of it, or did you find it a little spottier than perhaps that stable currency kind of beat for an FT?
I mean, I didn't want to do either full time. I wanted to write about everything and about the world and about why people are rich and why people are poor and go to amazing places and speak to people there about things other than soccer as well. And so I found myself trapped in this soccer beat, partly as soccer got bigger. You could write about it all the time. And I was always getting emails, will you write a profile of Wayne Rooney? Will you, go to Istanbul and write about this game? And it's all fun, but I didn't like doing it full time because it is quite a limited world, and you find yourself sitting in the press conference with 100 other journalists and the coaches talking nonsense about we lost because of the referee, and the questions are very stupid, and the coaches obviously engaging in self-justification. And you think, why am I here? And this really doesn't matter that much. Why are we all here? I remember I was in Ukraine in 2012, and the British media, by then running out of money, had sent 200 people or so, journalists, to this press conference with the England manager where he said absolutely nothing of interest. And so we were all there at amazing expense. And I thought, I don't want to be here. I don't want to be doing this all the time.
But as a lens to the world, right? Geopolitical things and humanity and cultures and sporting life generally, the stories, it seems that the sport of soccer, for better or for worse, almost seems to be a lens on humanity, if done and written and observed properly, right? I perhaps maybe more so than any other sport in this world.
Yeah, because it's the global game. I mean, I was actually very inspired as a teenager reading American writing on baseball because it hadn't occurred to, I lived in California when I was 11 for about a year, in sixth grade, and I, fell for baseball. And I read these people like John Updike. I'd never heard of him, but he wrote this piece about Ted Williams retiring at the Red Sox. And Updike goes to Williams' farewell game and he writes this incredible piece about it and he analyzes Williams as a personality. And I thought, wow, I don't know who this guy Updike is, but I didn't know you could write about sport like that it tells you just so much more than who won, what this person is, what Boston is like. And yeah, I mean, I wanted to bring that kind of writing to soccer, soccer is so much more than soccer, because when a game matters to billions of people, it is still a game, but it's also more than a game. And so my first book, Soccer Against the Enemy, which I wrote, in the early 90s, takes that approach. And I find that fascinating. And it's how in this World Cup book, I've tried to write about the World Cup, that it's about soccer, but it's also about much more. It tells you things about the world, about the US, about Russia, about Qatar, about people everywhere. And I try to follow those stories. But when you're writing about it every week, you do tend to fall into, why are Manchester United playing badly? And what is the scandal over this coach and who will they hire to succeed him? And that can get pretty dispiriting, as you grow older and you think, really, is this what I'm doing with my whole life?
Well, and I assume it probably gets worse too with you layer in gambling, sports betting, prediction markets now, these kinds of things where that minutia and maybe that tedium actually becomes, I don't know, crack cocaine, if you will, for a whole layer of quote unquote fan that depends on that kind of stuff because they're looking at making their bets, not necessarily being fans of the game per se, but, to influence their decision making when it comes to their wagers.
Yeah, and I'm queasy about that because a lot of sports media and soccer clubs depend on the gambling industry, the sports betting industry.
Yes.
And sports betting is a much bigger industry than sport. If you look at the revenue, if you look at the revenues worldwide, and in China we don't even know what the revenues are, but those we can measure. And especially now it's been legalized, I think very largely in the US. It's taken off like crazy. It has enormously damaging social consequences. But those are the people who will advertise on, the shirts of the biggest soccer clubs and will sponsor podcasts and that kind of thing. And yeah, I don't really want to live in that world all the time.
All right, explain to me your experiences in the latter World Cups leading up to this one, and then we'll spend the bulk of the rest of the conversation on where we are today and where we might be going, good, bad, or indifferent. Excuse me. This is the 2000s, right? Was this journey between sort of an occasion, every other year, it's every other tournament. It seems like it would revert back to Europe or to South America, but in between, right, these almost a conquering kind of approach to places like South Africa and Japan, Korea, and Russia in many respects, kind of a closed market for most of pro soccer's history. Explain that through sort of your lens of coverage. I'm sure they're all different and unique, but it's also clearly part of a plan of some sort to truly expand the game to become that global kind of spectacle. Still hasn't sort of arguably conquered all the major countries of the world. But how would you describe that process through your coverage? It's a little inelegant and probably a bit of a challenge for the historical soccer fan, right, from Europe and South America, to get up in the morning at 2 o'clock in the morning and watch their teams play in, time zones that are 14, time zones away, right?
I mean, look, it used to be our game and it's not our game anymore. It's the world's game, which is beautiful because from the early 90s, it's on television and it turns out to just win the Darwinian battle of sport on television. And so, it beats baseball in Japan, it challenges baseball in America, and everywhere you get this process that soccer arrives and it starts to compete against the local sports, the indigenous sports, often say cricket in the Caribbean. And in the US, football has held out extremely strong against it. And the US is one of the places where soccer has not made the most successful inroads. But very broadly, that's where the growth is. So the four biggest countries in the world, I think 45% of the world population is India, China, US, and Indonesia. And these countries are now, in the last 20 years, switching on to soccer. So that's an enormous market, and FIFA sponsors are excited about that. And I think FIFA would love to have a World Cup in India or China, but those countries are not quite keen enough, not quite ready. But I think you give FIFA too much credit when you say it's a plan. I mean, a lot of global institutions viewed from the inside, it's kind of a few men in a cash box looking to put some money away in some bank accounts that they have. And, I describe in the book the process of voting on the same day to host the World Cup in Russia in 2018 and Qatar in 2022. And it's clear that this is not a clean process and that quite a few people made some money out of this. So, I mean, what's new is that countries like Qatar, Russia, Saudi Arabia for 2034 say, hey, we'd like to host the World Cup. And then also, we have a lot of money. How can we help? And so this is not a kind of process done in the interests of soccer first and foremost, but the interests of the old men who run FIFA. It's it's a very kind of ugly underside. And the FBI, to the credits of the US as it was before, did a lot to expose that.
Yeah, but sadly, it seems like it's regressed. And maybe we'll use this as a sort of the pivot point. We're having this conversation a number of months before the most audacious on so many different levels, both positively and pejoratively, of tournaments with 48 teams now and 3 countries and just a completely unaffordable ticket pricing scheme. Yeah. And I mean that pejoratively. How did we get here to this point where there is so much consternation around this tournament and maybe trepidation about where it's going?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. There's 3 slightly separate points. 48 teams means a lot of the soccer is going to be very poor quality. So teams like Jordan or Curacao, they wouldn't survive in the English Premier League. They might not even survive in the English second tier, the Championship. So you're going to be watching a lot of games that people who are used to watching Real Madrid and Manchester City are going to think, what? Do these people get paid to play soccer? And a lot of the poorer teams are just going to sit in front of goal in the hope of not being humiliated. So 48 teams is to create more television content. The more games, the better. Because as a sport, you can go for abundance. We have a lot of games like the NBA, or you can go for kind of scarcity. Every game is important, which is the NFL. So soccer is moving from abundance. World Cup is moving from abundance to scarcity to abundance. We have loads of games. The soccer is going to be mostly bad. So you have to have it over 3 countries because even for the US, this is quite a lot to host. And then you have the ticket prices, which, I mean, it flies in the face of the World Cup tradition that it's not really about money and can you afford it, and it's not a profit-making venture. That if you really love your national team, you should be able to get into the World Cup with what for a citizen of a developed world is a kind of reasonable price. So historically, it's always been under, let's say, equivalents of $100 today, sometimes even significantly cheaper than that. And because in the US, people are used to paying crazy sums, people can pay thousands of dollars to sit courtside at the Knicks. A lot of Americans will pay this money. I mean, I spoke to an Irishman in America. He said he'd been asked for $3,000 to buy a ticket to watch South Africa, to play terrible soccer. but Americans will do it. The stadiums are going to be full. So that kind of is very insulting and upsetting to historical fans of World Cups. And then the third element is the kind of, it's in a country that is not welcoming to the world, zero, where Trump has kind of issued visa bans on many of the participating countries. So their fans won't even be able to get in. And as I say, you're not going to get Mexicans gathering in a bar, particularly to watch the game together in their Mexico shirts, because, who knows when ice will burst in. So even when it was in Russia in 2018, Russia actually welcomed the world. And if you had a World Cup ticket, a ticket to a game, you could get in without a visa, which I think had never happened, in the last 200 years of Russian history. And people, you had Poles and Senegalese people dancing on Red Square in front of the Kremlin after games. Again, totally a breach with Russian history. Even Russia opened its doors. And the US is a country that's now closing its doors to the world. So those three things, too many bad games, too high ticket prices, an unwelcoming host country, are really casting a pall.
What do you think is ahead in the next couple of months? I mean, I've talked to so many different sort of folks when they're different lenses and stuff of this, like ranging from this is just the way it is and get used to it. It's only going to get worse in terms of scale and cost and spectacle and all that stuff to this may be a watershed and maybe the biggest black eye that could possibly happen. And it will be, either a disaster or certainly a significant divot, if you will, or mogul in the growth of the game and stuff. Is this overreach? It just feels to me that it is absolutely that.
I mean, it's going to be very ugly, and Trump is going to turn himself into the main character of the World Cup, commenting every day, criticizing Canada, Mexico, referees, players, making outrageous comments, because he understands this is the biggest media event in history, measured by, clicks and views, and he needs to be every day the main character of it, because Trump, above all, produces TV content. That's kind of what he does as president. And it's going to be very ugly, and bad stuff is going to happen. And bad stuff of different kinds always happens at World Cups. In the 80s, there was hooliganism. 90s, it was massively over-publicized because it looked good on TV, but it was there. In 1994, the Colombian player Andres Escobar is shot dead in Colombia after going home. He scored an own goal against the US. Who knows whether it was related to that. So you always get these kind of horror stories. And football always survives and thrives and grows because it's a great game. And in a sense, the scandals and the horrors, they feed the legend. They get people turning on, get people more interested. I mean, if it was all just kind of happy, clappy and beautiful soccer, it wouldn't quite be enough. And in the end, when the World Cup starts, what people are talking about most of the time from the first game is the soccer. Did you see that goal? That was never a penalty. Can you believe that this nowhere team have reached the semi-final? The story before the World Cup is about the scandals, and from the moment it kicks off, it's about the soccer.
Yes, that said, though, right, the shadow of Qatar, right, and the backstory of how that came about and the workers and all that kind of stuff, the return to the Middle East so quickly, already voted on in another sort of FIFA thumb on the scale kind of way, plus this just sheer crazy expansion of stuff. I guess the real sort of question in there is at what point do fans sort of push back, right? I mean, I'm starting to see rumblings now, as you might as well. I mean, the German Federation folks are now talking about the word boycott. It's something that was kind of, rumbling around as the tickets were sort of initially unveiled and the resale prices and that kind of stuff. I don't know. It feels to me like there may be some groundswell for something from the fans and something from the hoi polloi, if you will, of soccer fandom. That is like, maybe this is a line too bright that can't be crossed.
I think fans will always watch the World Cup, and people will always express their horror. And there's often talk of a boycott. I mean, to my knowledge, one team ever boycotted a World Cup in 1974, Soviet Union, because Pinochet's Chile were there. Otherwise, everyone goes. I mean, I was hesitating last week. I thought if Trump really does invade Greenland, it will be hard for the Europeans to go to a country with which they're sort of at war. I mean, that would have been a big bridge. But I don't see a boycott. There's always a few fans who make a lot of noise, and understandably so, about not watching for moral reasons. But every World Cup is bigger than the previous one. Qatar, for all the bad things the country does in relation to treating women and LGBT people and migrants as second class citizens, migrant deaths, building infrastructure. It was a hugely successful World Cup in terms of its popularity. And in the global south, where most of the world's population live, there was this feeling, well, you hypocritical Europeans, you attack Qatar, but you're not very nice to migrants yourselves, etc. And the global south was very much on board with a Qatar World Cup. US, of course, is a different thing, but I just think a World Cup is too big for people not to watch.
We'll set the tone beyond this, and we'll see how it goes, right? I tend to have great feelings of negativity around this tournament, and I'm a huge soccer fan, right? But I'm just a little, and I've got connections, but I've got my bid in for 2 tickets to, I think it's England and Panama at the New Jersey venue.
Wow.
If I get
game.
them, yeah, but big game, right? Well, maybe come on. And the reality is that it's the tier 2 tickets. If we're lucky, I'm going to get them, and my dad and I are going to actually enjoy a game like we did, some years ago in '94, for the low price of maybe $1,200 for a first. So, that's actually list price. That's not even resale. That's just insane, and it's just, and having been a fan of this game in the darkest of days in this country, it's an affront, and I'm sure, and that's mild by comparison to the sheer passion that's existed for many, many decades and generations in other parts of the world, who also have that extra burden of trying to get to this country, get a visa, not get arrested, all that kind of stuff. Okay, so put all of that, and so let's assume that we sort of survive and we're still living in 2027. Tell me about 2030, though. I'm sure you've been paying attention to this too, but we're talking, there's been thought about having 64 teams in that tournament, or maybe the tournament thereafter. And my understanding, if I remember correctly, that there are going to be like 6 different countries involved in trying to host this thing. I mean, for some kind of, at what point does this become just beyond lunacy?
I mean, you devalue the World Cup. I mean, in 2030, yeah, there's going to be a couple of games at the beginning in 3 South American countries, but then the bulk of the tournament is in Spain, Portugal, Morocco, historic soccer countries, lovely places to visit. Probably not run by lunatics at that point. So, light relief in comparison. Tickets won't be $1,200 for, my gosh, England, Panama. But so I think we need to get through this World Cup in America. But look, the thing you have to remember is that the percentage of people who actually go to a game at a World Cup in a stadium in their lives is well below 1% of the world's soccer fans. Most people, like the fan in Brazil or in Mumbai or in Shanghai or in Soweto, they never really even imagine going to a World Cup game. It's just not on their radar. The World Cup for them is something you watch on television with your family and friends, and you have games that you remember 50 years later, and you remember what grandma said when that player scored and what your dad said when your team lost in the final. And it's sort of inscribes itself in your memories and your life. And it's not about being in the stadium. The stadium is people like you. You're going to watch England, Panama, you and your dad, and you're not even going to care who wins particularly. So that already deflates the atmosphere at the stadium. The idea that people have that the stadium is full of just kind of totally emotional fans is because the TV zooms in on, the 27 people who are very emotional fans of Panama. But that's not the feel you get in the stadium. It's all going to be kind of New Jersey day trippers who spend too much money. So the World Cup happens in the living rooms of the world and in the bars of the world. It doesn't really happen so much in the stadium. That to me is almost a second order problem.
Do you think the FIFA Club World Cup experience last year that happened in the States, and there were some warning signs there that maybe this is not going to go as smoothly as Gianni and Donald think it's going to go?
Well, I mean, look, it was too hot, and it's going to be too hot this summer. And I mean, nobody cared who won the Club World Cup. I mean, even my sons, who are Paris Saint-Germain fans, didn't really care. It was a ludicrous tournament. It was organized because Saudi Arabia, which is now the biggest funder of soccer, put up an enormous amount of money to have the tournament in the US for reasons I don't fully understand. So it was like a kind of large summer exhibition for tired players. And the World Cup is just different. Players do desperately care about the World Cup. I mean, in the book, I recount this one, for me, quite telling conversation. I was giving this course on football finance, soccer finance, to these guys who'd all played for their countries, and some had played at World Cups. And so I'm in a classroom where it was a very weird experience. You're at the front of the classroom. It looks like a university classroom, but the people in the seats are these world famous footballers who've now retired, but you'd see them all in the biggest stadiums in the world 10 years earlier. And we were having lunch afterwards, and one guy who played in a team that won the World Cup, he said to me, "What do you think about the World Cup in Qatar?" And I issued the usual criticisms of Qatar. And he said, if I was still playing today, I would totally go and play in Qatar, because he said a World Cup just gives so much pleasure to so many people around the world. And a lot of those people are poor, they have difficult lives, they don't have much pleasure in their lives. They really look forward to the World Cup and they live it with their families. And he said, you want to deprive them of that? And this other guy who played, I think, one World Cup said, if you're lucky as a player, you play one World Cup in your career. And are you asking players to not play what might be their only World Cup because it's in Qatar, something they could do nothing about? They didn't choose to have it in Qatar. They don't know about Qatar. It's not their fault. He says no player is going to miss it for that reason. So I respect those arguments. The World Cup transcends Qatar, it transcends Donald Trump. It's just a great and beautiful thing. And we don't have that many moments when the world is kind of happy and partying together and appreciating beauty and skill. And one of the great things about the World Cup is, if a Cameroonian or a Brazilian does something amazing, we all feel it, we all see it. Even if you're not Cameroonian yourself, you think, wow, that was great. And so in a sense, it's a shared moment for everyone, or almost everyone.
All right. Well, don't take this last question, and then we'll let you promote and stuff. I don't take this the wrong way, but isn't that feels nostalgic to me, right? Already, in that it almost feels countervailing to that argument where we are now in terms of the pricing and pricing out those very fans that this tournament and the global game and the beautiful game, as Pele used to call it, purports to uplift. Clearly television is the product for the bulk of those who consume this tournament, but isn't it being hollowed out simultaneously, perhaps, by the cash grab and the unaffordability and the weakening, frankly, of the play, given the 48, maybe 64 teams and stuff, right? So that just feels to me like a countervailing argument that, while I would agree with you, right, just seems to get weaker and weaker as an argument, perhaps, as we move forward.
Well, I mean, in my time covering World Cups, I can't remember a World Cup that was approached with more negativity than Qatar. And, I'm a jaded old journalist. I'm usually not the guy who's kind of, smiling blissfully at some amazing thing on the field. But the world is. People really loved the World Cup in Qatar. It really moved, hundreds of millions, maybe billions of people. And it will be the same in the US. And none of this is new. None of these horrors are new. In 1934, the World Cup is in fascist Italy. Benito Mussolini makes his own trophy, this massive bronze trophy, which is kind of bigger than the World Cup trophy, to give to the victorious Italian team. And of course, Italy have to win. The Argentinian military regime hosted in 1978, just as they've disappeared thousands of dissidents, dropped them from airplanes into the River Plate River, and the world goes to the World Cup. And we have the same discussions then, this is a horrible regime. Should we be playing? In the Netherlands, where I was living as a child, there was a boycott movement. It didn't happen. In 2018, who's the host of the World Cup? It's Vladimir Putin. The first match of the World Cup, this grotesque spectacle, Russia-Saudi Arabia. In the VIP box, it's Putin, Gianni Infantino, and the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. I mean, these are the people at the top of the world. So away from the field, it very often feels grotesque. My first World Cup in 1990, England fans are kind of sacking Sardinia. It's horrible, but you still have so much beauty.
No, it's very interesting, and we live in interesting times. All right, here's my last question, and I promise we'll promote the heck out of the book, of course, for sure. That's the whole
Please,
reason why
please.
we're doing this, right? But
Yeah.
just give me a sense of your perspective, right? Your unique perspective. You've been with this game on and off, and varying levels of intensity for decades now. The World Cup being sort of the pulse every 4 years, so to speak. Where do you see the game generally? At the pro level, the international level, World Cup included. Is it a good place? Is it in a healthy place? Do you see things around corners perhaps that maybe are lurking, or is this just going to get bigger and better and it's a straight line upwards of goodness, so to speak, or riches, so to speak?
I mean, my sense is it's going to grow and grow. And we know that soccer has this magical power. So it arrives in the 19th century, in countries from Russia to Argentina, and immediately it conquers. And very quickly, it's a massive game. And then 100 years later, it starts to reach, as I say, China, India, the US, Indonesia, Canada, Australia, Japan, countries that hadn't confronted it before. And it's a bit slower because, those countries by the 90s, the 2000s already have their own big sports. But still, soccer makes amazing inroads because it's just the beautiful game. It really works on TV. It has 150 years of history, which is terrifically compelling. So I think it's going to grow. And the other thing is, most people now, of course, spend most of their lives on a screen, usually alone. And that makes the experience of going to a soccer game where people are expressing genuine emotions and cheering and chanting and singing together, which is more than you get at most sporting occasions. I mean, I've watched a fair bit of tennis, say. You don't really get that kind of unified crowd feeling at most tennis matches. In American sports, people are going to get, food all the time. A lot of NBA games, you see incredible basketball, but you don't really get people kind of living and dying. And most people barely care in an NBA game, regular season, who wins. So that kind of emotion of the soccer stadium is just this very rare communal experience in today's world. And I think people really, because it's so rare, want to be part of that.
I love this book. It's a really good, if you're a fan of the game and have gone to or have seen certainly these World Cups over the decades, right? It's a great way to kind of through your journalistic lens, kind of go back and try to square these with one's own memories of the games, whether you were there in person or watched on television and stuff. I love your little side story about trying to find the original Jules Rimet Cup, the first version of the trophy, and that kind of stuff. What inspired you to write it in this form, and what else are you going to be doing to promote it besides being on silly little podcasts like mine?
I love being in podcasts like yours and to talk to somebody who really cares about all this stuff as I do. What inspired me is I thought, it's a pretty unusual experience, 9 World Cups. And in Qatar, they gave awards to people members of this international press organization I'm not part of, who've been to 8. And there were a few dozen, and, most of those people are never going to write a book. And I thought, I have a fairly unique experience. I've taken notes. I have these notebooks in my office in Paris of, people I saw in 98, of conversations I had, of photographs of, me in restaurants, the young me. And I thought, I want to put this together and write a kind of history of the modern World Cup using my experiences of what it's actually like to be there and the people, the players, talking to players, being in crazy places like the Amazon or the battlefield at Stalingrad. The World Cup takes you to places you'll never visit again. I wanted to put all that together. I've been planning to write this book for well over a decade, and I finally sat down and did it ahead of the American World Cup.
All right, I'll let you promote, but let me ask, what are your plans for this one? You're coming, I'm assuming, right?
Well, from your lips to God's ears, I hope so. So I'm very dependent on my newspaper, the Financial Times, to ask me to go and request accreditation. So anyone who could put in a good word with me, with my Financial Times colleagues, please do, because I really want to go to this World Cup. I'm sort of addicted to World Cups. It's my main immersion in soccer nowadays in the 4-year cycle. I'm not in the stadium every kind of weekend anymore. World Cups I live them.
All right, there it is. That is the official last word we have, at least until the tournament is over. on the World Cup. And we appreciate you listening and endorsing all of these episodes that we've done for you in the last couple of months. That's kind of given you as many different backgrounds and approaches to both understanding as well as appreciating and hopefully enjoying to some extent this upcoming tournament that kicks off in just a few days. And our thanks to Simon for that longitudinal look. He is uniquely positioned, having been an attendee and a reporter since 1990, and he'll be doing so again in this upcoming tournament for the Financial Times. You can follow Simon's coverage at the Financial Times' website, ft.com/Simon, Simon-Kuper, Kuper, ft.com/Simon-Kuper. You can also follow Simon at his handles on X at Kuper Simon, Kuper-Simon, and on Blue Sky, simonkuper.bsky.social. Of course, you can get a copy of his book. It's called World Cup Fever, A Soccer Journey in 9 Tournaments. It is published by our friends at Pegasus. It is available now wherever you get your good books. And of course, you can get the hardcover or the Kindle versions. I believe there's even an audiobook version from our friends at Amazon by clicking on our links, either in the show description, however you get this podcast, or on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com, searching up this episode number 449. Well, you'll also find those convenient links. And again, our friends at Amazon give us a couple of shekels, and it's not a lot of them, of referral love every time somebody purchases a book in that manner, for which we are deeply appreciative both to them as well as certainly to you for doing so. You can follow us on the socials as well. You'll find us on X at Good Seats Still. You'll find us on Blue Sky at goodseatsstillavailable.com and just about everywhere else at Good Seats Still Available, all one word, including YouTube, where we also stream and post these episodes for you each week, as well as on your favorite podcast feed/catcher. Our thanks, of course, to Jerry Payne for his audio excellence this week, as always. Oh, and our email address, forgot that too. We're at hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. All right, we don't know what's going to happen, but the point of no return is approaching. So good luck with any and all of your World Cup endeavors. I think I'm going to go to a game in one of the knockout rounds in New Jersey. I finally think I found a way to go without sort of mortgaging the house. Let us know what your experiences are as the days and weeks roll on. And many more different conversations come your way, not in soccer in the World Cup. We will give you a rest on that for at least a few months. And please stay tuned to your feeds. More to come, and we'll see you next week.